15 years ago, my sister Emma drove away from this house in the middle of a February snowstorm, her taillights bleeding red through the flurries. She left behind her feverish little boy, a duffel bag, and a note that said, "I can't do this anymore. Please don't call. I haven't seen her since. Until tonight." Before I go on, I just want to say, if this story reaches you, if you've ever been betrayed by someone who should have protected you, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me tell more stories like this. And maybe, together, we'll remind the world that loyalty is a choice, not an accident of DNA. Okay, back to that night. Emma stood on my porch again, 15 years older, sun-kissed, dressed in a cream coat that screamed money. A man stood beside her, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "Sarah," she said, her voice syrupy with fake warmth. "You look—" "Well," I almost laughed. I looked nothing close to well. My jeans were paint-stained, my sweater unraveling at the sleeve. But what caught me most wasn't her or her new husband's smug faces. It was the way her eyes flicked toward the framed photo hanging behind me, the one of a tall young man in medical scrubs. My nephew, Jacob, the boy she'd left dying in my arms. "Where is he?" she asked, stepping inside uninvited. "We wanted to visit his grave." "Grave?" I repeated. Emma nodded solemnly. "He only had 6 months. We assumed—" A voice came from the hallway. Deep, steady, calm. Assumed wrong. Jacob stood in the doorway, 6 feet tall, his stethoscope hanging loose around his neck. "Evening, Aunt Emma. Uncle Greg." The room went silent. Emma's face drained of color so fast I thought she might faint. Greg actually took a step backward, his smirk cracking. He stammered. "You were supposed to be dead?" Jacob's smile didn't reach his eyes. You'd be surprised how often doctors hear that one. I felt the tension in the room coil like wire. I could almost hear my own pulse. Emma's perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she set down her purse. "This is unbelievable," she murmured. "You're a doctor?" "Pediatric oncology," he said softly. "I save kids who get left behind." She flinched like he'd slapped her. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching the 2 people who'd abandoned a dying child realize that the child had outlived their excuses. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Then Emma smiled, thin and tight as a blade. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "we didn't come to relive the past. We came because of Mother's estate." The words hit me like a slap. Mother's estate. She hadn't even shown up to the funeral 3 months ago. "Mother left everything to both of us," Emma continued, opening her designer purse. 50-50. The farmhouse, the land, the savings account. "We'll need to sell quickly." I stared at her. "You've got to be kidding." Greg leaned against the mantel, smirking again. "You can't afford the upkeep on this place. Do the smart thing, Sarah. Sell, split, move on." Jacob stepped closer, his jaw tight. "You mean steal?" Emma's eyes flicked to him again, and for the first time, I saw fear there. Not guilt, not shame, but fear. Because standing in front of her wasn't the sick little boy she'd dumped in the snow. It was a man she couldn't manipulate. She forced a brittle laugh. "Oh, Jacob, you always were dramatic." "No," he said quietly. "You just never stayed long enough to see what drama looks like when someone fights back." The air in the room shifted, heavier, colder. I realized then that whatever had brought Emma and Greg back to Vermont, it wasn't grief, it was desperation. The next morning, the snow had stopped, but the world still looked raw and scraped clean. The air outside smelled like iron and wood smoke. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, rereading the copy of Mother's will Emma had left behind. It was true. Everything, house, land, and what little money was left, had been split evenly between the 2 of us. Jacob walked in, still in his scrubs from an overnight shift at the hospital. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were alert, sharp. "They're broke," he said before I could ask. "I ran a search last night. Greg's company folded 2 years ago. They're drowning in debt," I sighed. "So that's why they're here." He nodded grimly. "They're not grieving. They're scavenging," I wanted to scream. My mother had built this house with her own hands. The walls still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. The thought of selling it to bail out my sister's mess made my stomach twist. The phone rang. It was him, Mr. Collins, our family lawyer. He'd handled the Whitman estate since before I was born. "Sarah, good to hear your voice," he said in that too smooth tone of his. "I've reviewed the will. Everything seems in order. Emma's interpretation is correct." "I don't understand," I said. "She abandoned the family 15 years ago. She never even called. Doesn't that matter? In a moral sense?" "Certainly," he replied, his voice almost sympathetic. "But legally?" "No. Unless your mother amended her will after Emma left, which she didn't, your sister retains full rights to her inheritance." Something in his voice made my skin crawl. It was too calm, too rehearsed. "What are my options?" "You could buy out her half," he said. "But you'd need close to $1 million to do that." I let out a hollow laugh. "I'm a high school art teacher, Mr. Collins. I don't have that kind of money." Then I suggest selling the property. It's the pragmatic choice. Pragmatic. That word stung. It sounded like surrender dressed up in legal jargon. When I hung up, Jacob was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Something's off about him," he said. "Mr. Collins?" "Yeah, I remember him from when I was a kid. Always acted like family. Now he's pushing you to sell the second Emma shows up?" He frowned. "I'll make a few calls. I have a friend in finance who can check transactions." I wanted to tell him not to let it go, but the look in his eyes stopped me. That fierce, steady determination. The same look he'd had as a child hooked up to IV lines, refusing to quit. By afternoon, he had news. He came home with his jaw set hard. "Greg wired Collins $20,000 last week," he said flatly. I had my friend trace it. "It's clean, well hidden, but real." My mouth went dry. "You're saying he's being paid off?" "Bought," Jacob said. "Just like they always do. By loyalty, by silence, by justice." I felt the room tilt. The betrayal stung worse than Emma's. I had trusted Collins. He'd held my hand at Mother's funeral. He'd promised to protect me. Jacob's hand covered mine. "Mom," he said quietly. It still startled me every time he called me that. "We'll find someone else. A real lawyer. One we can trust." I wanted to believe him. But when I looked out the window and saw Emma's white SUV parked at the end of the long driveway, I knew she was already 10 steps ahead. That night, an envelope slid under my front door. My name typed neatly across it. Inside, official paperwork, a lawsuit. Emma and Greg were suing me to force the sale of the property. The words blurred as I read them, my pulse thudding in my ears. They claimed I was emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, unfit to manage inherited assets. All lies. Jacob stood beside me, reading over my shoulder. His voice was low, deadly calm. "They're trying to bury us, Mom, but they don't know who they're dealing with." I looked at the papers again. Somewhere in that maze of legal jargon and greed, I caught a faint whiff of gasoline. Not literally, just that same electric sense of danger, the kind that hums under the skin before something catches fire. And I knew then, Emma wasn't done ruining my life. She was just getting started. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and paperwork. Every time I thought I'd seen the worst of Emma's cruelty, she managed to find a lower rung to stand on. Her lawyer, a polished woman named Dana Kerrigan, called daily with friendly reminders about upcoming hearings. I started leaving the phone off the hook. I barely slept. I'd lie awake at night listening to the wind slip through the window seams, imagining Emma's voice whispering from the dark, "Sell, Sarah, give up." Jacob spent his nights at the hospital, his days chasing down new legal help. Finally, he found a young attorney named Chris Alvarez, a former public defender with more passion than polish. "He's honest," Jacob said, "and cheap." When Chris showed up, he was carrying a notebook full of sticky tabs and a cup of gas station coffee. "I won't lie to you," he said, scanning the lawsuit. "They've built a strong case on paper, fabricated or not. But we can challenge it. It'll take time, and they're hoping you can't afford that." "I can't," I said quietly. "Not for long. Jacob squeezed my shoulder. Then we find another way. A week later, I got suspended from work. The principal called me in. Sympathetic eyes, careful voice. Parents are nervous about the court case. They read things online about instability Emma's doing. She'd leaked the lawsuit to the local paper. When I got home that evening, I found Jacob waiting on the porch steps, phone pressed to his ear. His face was stone. Yeah, he said into the phone. Dig up everything you can. Financial records, business filings, anything. He hung up and looked at me. I hired a private investigator. Name's Logan Pierce, ex-cop. Jacob, that'll cost my money, he said firmly. And it's worth it. That night, the investigator called back. The news came like a fist to the gut. Emma and Greg were bankrupt. Millions in debt from a failed real estate scheme in Miami. Creditors were circling. They had 30 days to produce funds or face criminal charges. That was why they needed the house. Not for sentiment, for survival. I stared at the peeling wallpaper behind the phone and felt sick. They'll destroy everything, I whispered. Just to save themselves. Jacob's jaw tightened. Then we don't let them. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. 2 nights later, I woke to the sharp smell of smoke. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The room glowed orange at the edges, flickering like candlelight. Then Jacob's shout shattered the haze. Mom! Fire! I stumbled out of bed. The hallway was a tunnel of smoke. My throat burned as we ran, coughing, half blind, down the stairs. Flames clawed up from the kitchen doorway, alive, furious. Jacob grabbed the fire extinguisher, but it was no use. The fire had eaten through half the back wall already. We bolted outside into the freezing night, barefoot in the snow, as the house we'd fought so hard to keep roared like a beast. The volunteer fire department arrived within minutes, but it was too late. The kitchen and den were gutted. The rest of the house was choked black with smoke. When the fire marshal arrived, his expression was grim. This wasn't electrical, he said, crouching near the charred doorway. Gasoline residue along the back wall. Somebody did this on purpose. Arson. I looked at Jacob. His eyes were dark with fury. Emma, he said. It has to be, the marshal frowned. You got proof of that? Not yet, Jacob said. But I will. Emma and Greg showed up at dawn, wrapped in coats, pretending to be horrified. Oh my God, Sarah, Emma cried, hand to her mouth. Are you okay? This is terrible. Her eyes flicked to the wreckage behind me, calculating, not grieving. Greg muttered something about insurance and walked the perimeter, like a man admiring his new purchase. Jacob's hand clenched at his side. You sleep well last night? He asked coldly. Emma blinked, playing innocent. Excuse me? Just wondering if you heard any sirens. Her fake smile froze. Just for a second. Then she said, You shouldn't make accusations you can't prove. Doctor, and for the first time I realized she wasn't bluffing. She was threatening. That night, I sat in Jacob's apartment, staring at the soot-stained photographs I'd salvaged. My entire life reduced to a few smoke-scarred boxes. Mom, Jacob said, his voice steady but low, they think we're broken. That's their mistake. I looked up at him, at the resolve hardening in his face. What are you going to do? He gave a small, cold smile. Catch them. In their own trap. For the first time in weeks, Jacob looked like he had a plan instead of a wound. He stood at the kitchen counter of his apartment, his laptop open, papers spread across every inch of the surface. The early morning light cut sharp across his face, turning the circles under his eyes into bruises. They think we've given up, he said. Let's make them right, at least for now. I sipped my coffee, still trembling from the sleepless night. What do you mean? We tell them we're surrendering, he said simply. Sign the papers. Agree to the sale. Act defeated. Jacob, that's not surrender. That's suicide. No, he said, looking up at me with that calm, unnerving steadiness. It's bait. Before I could speak, his phone buzzed. It was Logan, the private investigator. Jacob answered on speaker. I dug deeper into their finances, Logan said. You were right. They wired 10 grand to a guy named Travis Boyd 3 days before your house went up in flames. Boyd's got priors: assault, arson for hire, petty fraud. He's disappeared since the fire. My chest clenched. So we can prove it? Not yet, Logan said. But if we can get them to talk about the payment, even brag, it's enough for the cops to reopen the case. That's your best shot. Jacob's eyes met mine. Then we make them talk. He turned to his laptop, pulling up a state statute. Vermont's a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, it's legal. So I'll be that person, I shook my head. You can't put yourself in danger like that. Mom, he said gently, using the word like armor. I'm not a child anymore. I know exactly what I'm doing. His confidence scared me more than the fire had. The next day, I called Emma. My voice trembled just enough to sound believable. You win, I said flatly. I'll sign whatever you need. I can't fight anymore. I could hear her exhale in triumph. I'm glad you've come to your senses, Sarah. Let's meet tomorrow morning at the title office in Burlington. 10 o'clock. Fine, I said. Just get it over with. When I hung up, Jacob was already texting Logan. She'll be celebrating tonight, he said. They'll drink, brag, drop their guard. That's when I go in. At 6 that evening, he put on a crisp white shirt, black vest, and borrowed apron, the uniform of a server at the Grand Lake Hotel, where Emma and Greg were staying. Jacob, I said quietly, following him to the door. If anything feels wrong, anything, you walk away. He smiled faintly. Don't worry, Mom. I've spent my whole life listening to people confess terrible things. Tonight won't be any different. At 7:20 p.m., he texted me. They're here. Ordered wine. I'll update soon. I sat in my car across the street from the hotel, heart pounding so hard it made my vision swim. The minutes crawled, then another text. They're getting loud. Logan nearby. Keep phone open. I turned on the speaker and waited. Muffled restaurant noise filtered through. The hum of conversation, clink of glasses, distant laughter. Then Emma's voice, unmistakable even through the static. I can't believe she fell for it, she was saying, laughter bubbling through her words. Sarah always was the weak one. All heart, no spine. Greg's slurred voice joined hers. And the fire idea? Genius. Dropped the value, sped up the sale, got the insurance people off our backs. Emma giggled. And she'll never prove a thing. Her little hero doctor can't save her from this one. I felt my stomach twist. The sound of Jacob's steady breathing came faintly through the speaker. He was standing right beside them, invisible in plain sight. Then Greg's tone shifted, darker. At least this time, nobody got hurt. Remember, Martin? We didn't get that lucky then. Emma hissed. Greg, shut up! What? It's over. He's dead. We handled it. You think the SEC's still looking for us? There was a pause. Then Emma's voice, low and sharp. We did what we had to do. He was going to turn us in. It was him or us. The sound of glasses clinking, laughter again. And then Jacob's whisper over the line. Got it. Every word. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands shook as I pressed the phone to my chest. When Jacob came out an hour later, Logan met him in the parking lot. They played the recording, clear, damning, undeniable. The private investigator whistled softly. They just handed you the keys to the jailhouse. The next morning, 10 o'clock sharp, we walked into the title office. Emma and Greg were already there, smiling like lottery winners. They didn't know that 2 FBI agents were waiting in the hallway. The title office smelled of printer ink and stale coffee. Emma sat at the head of the table, legs crossed, nails gleaming like tiny knives. Greg lounged beside her, smirking, one arm draped along the back of his chair as if the room already belonged to him. Sarah, Emma said sweetly, I'm glad you didn't make this harder than it needed to be. I didn't answer. My hands were steady on the folder in front of me, though my pulse thundered in my ears. Across the table, Jacob's expression was unreadable, calm, detached, clinical. He could have been prepping for surgery. Mrs. Chen, the title officer, began arranging the documents. If everyone could please review and sign, That was when the door opened. Two people stepped inside, FBI jackets crisp, faces carved from granite. Behind them, a pair of uniformed officers. The taller agent held up her badge. "Gregory and Emma Dalton?" Emma blinked, confused. "Yes?" The agent's tone was calm, almost polite. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. We also have questions regarding the death of Martin Keller in Florida." The color drained from Emma's face so fast it looked like someone had flipped a switch. Greg half stood, sputtering. "This is insane. What the hell are you talking about?" The agent didn't even flinch. "We have a recording of your conversation last night at the Grand Lake Hotel restaurant. You both discussed arranging the fire at 214 Timber Lane, as well as paying an individual named Travis Boyd to carry it out. You also described involvement in a fatal car tampering incident. Please stand." For a second, no one moved. Then Emma whispered, "Recording?" Jacob rose slowly. "One-party consent state," he said evenly. "You should have checked the laws before confessing to a felony over Cabernet." Greg lunged toward him, red-faced, but the officers were faster. They twisted his arms behind his back, handcuffing him as he shouted curses that made the clerk gasp. Emma just stared at me, trembling. "Sarah, please, you can't let them do this." I met her eyes, those same blue eyes that used to mirror mine when we were girls sharing secrets under a blanket fort. "You stopped being my sister when you left Jacob to die," I said softly. "And you finished the job when you set fire to my home?" Tears streaked her foundation. "You don't understand. We didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," I said. "You just kept picking yourself." The agent read her rights as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. She tried to turn toward Jacob, voice breaking. "Jacob, please. I'm your mother." He looked at her, cool, distant. "You're the woman who gave birth to me. Sarah's the one who raised me." That shut her up. Completely. Greg fought the whole way out, still spitting venom. Emma just sagged between the officers, eyes vacant. The illusion of control finally shattered. When the door closed behind them, the office fell silent. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat, still wide-eyed. "So, I'm assuming we're not proceeding with the sale?" "No," said Jacob. His voice was soft but final. "That house stays where it belongs." The next few weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and interviews. The story hit the local paper. Couple arrested in arson, murder, and inheritance fraud scheme. Cameras camped outside my apartment building for days. The fire investigator confirmed the evidence from the recording. The FBI traced Greg's payments to Travis Boyd, who'd fled to New Hampshire but was found hiding in a motel. Facing 20 years for arson, he confessed everything. Said Greg paid him $10,000, half before, half after, to lighten the insurance problem. When I heard those words, I had to leave the room. Lighten the insurance problem. That was my life they were talking about. My memories, my home, my father's workbench, my mother's quilts. Reduced to a problem to be solved with gasoline. By the time the trial began, the prosecutors didn't need my testimony to convict them, but I gave it anyway. I wanted to look Emma in the eye one last time. She barely glanced up when I took the stand. Greg glared openly, jaw tight, as if he still thought he could intimidate me into silence. When the prosecutor asked how I'd describe what Emma and Greg had done, I took a deep breath. "They chose greed over family," I said. "They thought blood would protect them. It didn't. The only thing that protects you in this world is loyalty, and they sold that cheap." The judge sentenced Greg to 20 years for arson, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Emma got 15 for accessory and perjury. I didn't feel triumphant when the gavel fell. Just hollow, exhausted. Afterward, Jacob and I walked out of the courthouse into a bright, brittle January morning. Snow flurries sparkled like ash in the sunlight. He looked over at me, his breath fogging the air. "It's over, Mom," I nodded. "Yeah," I whispered. But somehow, I don't think we've seen the last of the ashes. The months after the sentencing felt like standing in the quiet after a storm. Everything's still, but nothing quite the same. Insurance finally came through in March. enough to repair what the fire had devoured and then some. When the contractors arrived, tearing out the blackened walls and replacing them with fresh pine, the smell of sawdust filled the air like a promise. I moved back home that summer. The farmhouse looked different, new kitchen, new paint, but the soul of it felt unchanged. The big oak in the yard still bent toward the road like it was listening for someone coming home. Maybe, in a way, it had been waiting for us to come back. Jacob helped every weekend, hammer in hand, even after long hospital shifts. His department had offered him a promotion, Director of Pediatric Oncology Research at UVM Medical. When he told me, he downplayed it with a shrug. They want me to lead a new program, clinical trials for pediatric leukemia. Guess they think I know something about survival. I laughed, though tears blurred the edges of my vision. They're right. We rebuilt the kitchen together, one cabinet at a time. Sometimes we worked in silence. Sometimes we talked about the past in slow, careful sentences. The hurt was still there, but softer now, like an old scar that aches only when it rains. In late September, we hosted a small cookout. Neighbors, a few of Jacob's colleagues, even Logan Pierce and his wife. The fireflies came out early that evening, blinking above the grass like tiny lanterns. Logan handed Jacob a beer. "Hard to believe this is the same place that burned down," he said. "Some things refuse to stay ashes," Jacob replied. When the guests left, I stayed outside, sitting on the porch steps, watching the moon slide above the barn roof. The air smelled faintly of cedar and grilled corn. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel fragile. Jacob joined me, 2 mugs of cocoa in hand. He set one down beside me. "You ever think about her?" he asked quietly. "Emma?" I nodded. Sometimes. Not with anger anymore, just wondering if she finally understands what she lost. He took a slow sip. "She wrote to me from prison last month." My stomach tightened. "What did she say?" "That she was sorry. Said she prays for us every night. Asked if I'd ever visit." I looked at him. "And will you?" He shook his head gently. "I don't need her to say she's sorry. I already forgave her when I decided not to hate her." I smiled faintly. "You're better than I am." "No," he said. "You're the reason I know what love looks like." We sat there for a long time, listening to the crickets, the soft creak of the old porch swing. In the distance, the newly painted house glowed warm in the lamplight. Inside, photos lined the mantel. My parents' wedding picture. Jacob in his white coat, and a new one of him holding a little girl named Lily, the daughter of a nurse he'd started seeing. She'd called me Grandma the first time she met me. That word had undone me completely. I looked at the house, at my son beside me, at the world we'd remade from ruin. "Funny," I said softly. "Emma thought she could take everything from me. Turns out she just gave me more reasons to fight." Jacob smiled. "Guess that's the thing about fire. It burns away what's weak, but what survives? That's the real stuff." The night breeze carried the scent of pine and the faintest echo of laughter from inside. I closed my eyes, breathing it in, feeling something heavy finally lift. If you've listened this far, if my story found its way to you, thank you. Share it with someone who needs reminding that blood doesn't define family. Choice does. Loyalty does. Love does. Because in the end, that's what survived the fire. And that's what will always survive.